Greetings, YouTube. I'm sporting my new Quarterstaff Games t-shirt. I received a comment recently from one Joseph Keenan asking me about the divide in role-playing games between fantasy and science fiction. And I think he made an assertion that 90% of all games are fantasy, and I actually don't think that's correct. I haven't done an actual breakdown, but if anyone's been watching my RPG tours, I've put up 8 episodes so far. I think that there's actually more science fiction games out there than only 10%, but they are fewer than fantasy. And he asked me if I felt it was because, people feel more familiar with fantasy themes, and I think that is in many ways true. When we were growing up at our parents' knee and we're learning to understand, sorry, cat in the background, understand our culture and such, some of the things that parents do is tell us stories, fairy tales frequently. Sometimes they read traditional ones that have been passed down. Sometimes they tell you traditional ones that have been just orally transmitted as opposed to being in books. And the original stories that were recorded by the Brothers Grimm varied a lot. For example, Little Red Riding Hood had there's 35 or 38 versions of that story. So it's not a single story, it's a school of stories, really. But when we were growing up, we learned about dragons and elves and people that lived under the hill and evil sorcerers and despotic kings. And those are the things that we identified with as children. We weren't getting those stories told to us about aliens and spaceships that drop out of the sky and things like that. So I think that we have a natural inclination towards the fantastical over the science fiction, science-based entertainment. But if you look at television, how popular is science fiction? Look at films. How popular are science fiction films? And lots of films even are, just barely touch it because, they're speculative fiction, which I have actually always preferred to science fiction, because really it's a speculation on what will happen. It's not necessarily steeped deeply in science, as a lot of fiction will show itself to be very poor science, in fact. Look at Star Trek and Star Wars. There's crap science in both of those franchises, but they're still very entertaining. And I think you could argue in some ways that Star Wars is actual science fantasy. And there are science fantasy role-playing games out there. The one that comes to mind right off the top of the head is Dragonstar, which is an explicitly science fiction and fantasy game that uses both elements. And you could say steampunk, but a steampunk being is a fusion of science and fantasy. I think that the science fiction games make up more than 10% of the market, but they're less than fantasy, and I think they're always going to be less than fantasy. Remember, the first game that ever hit the market big was fantasy. Now, there isn't any reason that the first game that hit the market couldn't have been science fiction. There were miniature games that were using realistic, real-world, contemporary forces, like World War II miniatures, that for example, or Civil War. I think those could have moved into the science fiction realm and inspired a role-playing game based on science fiction, as opposed to period medieval miniature combat, which inspired the fantasy characters, which then became D&D. I don't think there's any reason that couldn't have happened, and Stars Without Number plays on that concept, that the first game that was ever released was science fiction rather than fantasy. So I'll ask my viewers, tell me, do you feel that the breakdown is really 90-10? You feel that science fiction is only represented in 10% of the community, or do you feel there's a higher percentage of role-playing games that are science fiction based, or at least touching on science fiction? And how do you feel about that breakdown? Do you think there should be more science fiction games? Do you feel that the science fiction fantasy percentages are where they should be? And do you agree with why fantasy is more prevalent in today's role-playing games than is science fiction?